I'm very excited about kicking it off. And we have a wonderful author to start off with. Alexandra McDermott is just finishing the Novel Studio this term. And she's an aspiring novelist and cookbook author. I've tasted some of her biscuits and they're delicious. She's got many skills. She moved to the UK in 2014 and she's working on a crime novel set in 1950s London. She's a staunch devotee and committed member of the Swanwick Writers' Summer School, reportedly the longest running residential writing school in the world, and the proud owner of 3 vintage typewriters. She's going to be taking us to Kansas. So do please, if you haven't already, mute yourselves and welcome Alexandra.
Breakdown. Somewhere along I-70, the air conditioning went. It is hard to say exactly where. In Kansas, the wide brown fields and high blue sky look the same everywhere. But we were nearer Salina than the Colorado state line. Tracy reached over and twisted the dial to full blue. "Don't bother," I told her. "It's broken." "What? You've got to be kidding. I'll swelter to death." Our hired Ford Taurus was black. It drew in heat like a magnet attracts staples. "Sorry, there's nothing I can do." She slumped down in her seat, red lipstick mouth pouting. "Why didn't you get a car in good condition, not a beat-up lemon?" There wasn't time to take it for a trial run. Eloping had been Tracy's idea. Her parents were high-tech, higher education entrepreneurs, imports from Colorado's Californian invasion, Silicon Valley in designer cowboy boots. "They wouldn't look twice at me," she had said. She jerked down the sun visor. "I know we made plans last minute, but you could have managed better than this, Chase." She began retouching her eye makeup. "When are we going to reach a rest area? I'm starving." I sighed. "Tracy, this is Kansas. There aren't rest stops. Just eat your lunch." "I don't like to eat while I'm driving." I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. Her hair clung damply to her neck. Sweat had made its dark roots almost black. I had never noticed before how obvious it was that she bleached herself blonde. Suddenly Tracy was screaming, and the road ricocheting under us like a roller coaster. I got my eyes back on the road and eased the car to a stop on a shoulder. "What happened? What happened?" Tracy clamored. "Lost a tire." I unsnapped my seatbelt and pulled off my suit jacket. I only had one. I climbed out of the car. The back of my shirt was saturated with perspiration. I felt the cloth steaming as the sun hit it. I got to work with the jack and toolbox. Tracy ventured over to see the damage. "Hand me the lug wrench, will you?" She handed me a screwdriver. I found the wrench myself. "Chase, you're getting all dirty. Can't you just call the auto club?" "The nearest garage is probably 100 miles away," I said. "Do you really want to sit in the car and wait all that time?" "I don't ever want to get back into that horrid car," she sniffed. "This whole trip is too awful for anything." I had been patient, but here I was, down on my knees on the fiery asphalt, prying off lug nuts that burned like coals from hell, and she was whining about how awful things were. "I'm sorry it's not first-class air travel like you're accustomed to, but going to St. Louis was your idea. How did you expect to get there without driving through Kansas?" "Don't you blame me!" "I'm not blaming you. I'm telling you to stop complaining." "Oh!" She kicked the toolbox lid shut. You... She was wonderfully pretty, even when she was mad. "I'm going home," she shrieked. "How are you going to do that without getting back in the car?" She would cool off in a second. She turned her back on me, staring away down the empty interstate. A dot appeared on the horizon, gradually growing squarer and sharper. It was a touring coach, a Greyhound probably. "They'll take me," she said, and bolted down the road. "Tracy, get out of the highway," I shouted. "You'll get run over." But the bus stopped. Tracy was talking to the driver. She pointed back at me a couple times. The driver helped her up the steps and closed the door. As the bus zoomed past, I saw faces staring down from every window. Somehow, I finished securing the tire. I clambered numbly back into the car and turned the key in the ignition. Nothing happened. I stared blankly at the key in my hand. The passenger side visor was still down. Tracy had left the mirror light on. All those hours since Denver. No wonder the battery had given up. I didn't really care. I wouldn't have chased after her anyway. Not now. But I felt such a fool. And those people on the bus. What had Tracy said? They must think me a monster, that a girl would risk hailing a bus going 70 miles an hour just to get away. I don't know how long I sat there. In Kansas, time, like space, seems to go on forever and never get anywhere. The fields sizzled under the burning sun. An old parable flashed through my mind. Immediately, the seed sprang up because it had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, it was scorched. And because it had no root, it withered away. I slammed a fist against the steering wheel. Need help? A white pickup had pulled up beside me. A girl was hanging out its window. Yeah, my battery's dead. She clicked her tongue. I haven't got my cables or I'd jump-start it for you. But don't worry, Dad's truck has a tow bar. He can come tow your car in while I give you a lift. Tow the car in? Is there a town around here? She shook her head, laughing, and her hair danced on her shoulders. It was pure gold, roots and all. Nah, just our farm. Hop in. What do you grow? Wheat. She shrugged as if to say, what else? I scrambled up into her Chevy. The engine roared into life, and an icy blast of air con raised the hair on my arms. She reached out a slim, deeply tanned hand and flicked the radio on. Country station, of course. Keith Whitley was singing. There are times that you've been around, you would have seen me broken down, but now I'm not. I'm over you. Amen, I thought.
Great.
So much. Thank you so much. That was brilliant, Alexandra. And you're singing as well. And I say good riddance, Tracy. I mean, honestly, what a dreadful woman. I was really there with your character. Thank you so much for that. That was fabulous. We're now moving somewhere completely different. We're going to be going between Leeds and Sweden with Marina Nendadic, who'll be reading Drowning Kittens in Gothenburg. Marina is an arts and cultural communicator, previously for Historic England and now Kew Gardens. She cites Dolly Parton's 1994 autobiography, My Life and Other Unfinished Business, as her greatest inspiration, both personally and professionally. She explored narrative nonfiction on Peter Forbes' City short course, which everyone says is fabulous. And I'm really excited to hear her read, so please welcome Marina. Marina, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Great, great, lovely. Sorry, the lighting in here is really bad, but hopefully that doesn't affect this too much. Drowning Kittens in Gothenburg. The fish aisle of Leeds Indoor Market is always cold, even colder than outside. Blue fishing nets frame white aproned men wielding giant cod. I pause to consider the occupants of a glass-fronted display, glistening wet with crushed ice and dancing plastic starfish. Tapping the glass, cramped lobsters squirm, failing to free their claws of elastic binds. My mormor tugs at me to walk on. It smells down the fish aisle. It's clever how elderly relatives are named in Sweden. That's where mormor is from, and she's my mother's mother. If she was my father's mother, we'd call her Farmore, and if she was a grandpa, she'd be more Far. Everyone knows who's who. Leaving the lobsters to their dim fate, we emerge into the high-ceilinged market hall, bustling and resplendent with red, white and green iron pillars. Each stall set in the round with domed archways carving spaces within space. I'm buoyed by the buzz, catching a waft of hot pies and cut flowers. At just hip height, I'm soon squished between Jean legs and lose hold of Mormore's hand. A burly trader holds court from the centre of her fruit and veg carousel, thrusting bundles into outstretched arms and shouting out offers on bananas, 50p a bag. Mormore has weaved to the front and is inspecting a cooking apple, deftly holding her coin purse, ready to barter. For a reserved woman, Mormore is barely fazed by what I consider to be a wholly frenzied experience, the market. Perhaps she enjoys the commotion, traders projecting across each other to lure shoppers in, neighbours chatting, children screaming, fresh pallets of produce landing on the paved floor that seem to orchestrate into a collective rhythmic hum. Mormore's life was otherwise quiet. When Mormore's sister came to visit us each summer, all three of us would come into town and they'd gab excitedly while pulling me in opposite directions, sharing secrets in another language I pretend to understand. Mormore and her sister looked the same to me, curved backs and curled hair. A beauty in her time, I always liked that I inherited Mormore's eyes and her first name for one of mine. Her aquamarine gaze finds its twin through the chaos, and she shoots me a knowing smile before negotiating a punnet of strawberries too, my favourite. Inspired by an attractive sailor and the promise of a pretty decent life, Mormore had left her home of Gothenburg, Sweden, aged 22. She told me that Gothenburg, a leafy city lined with canals and lakes, unravaged by war, winter snow fell up to chest height and the waterways turned to ice rinks. One winter, when the whole of Yorkshire had been brought to a standstill by a thick snowstorm quicker than the gritters, I had asked Mormore how anyone managed to get about in even more arduous conditions. Did she, as a small girl, dig straight through the snow, like a miner carving a coal tunnel? Or perhaps everyone donned skis and slid over the top? She advised that they just managed, somehow. Bags full of fresh fruit in tow, on our way home, Mormore and I stop by the best chip shop in town. We pull up a spot on our usual bench, opposite the market and the chip shop, the optimum vantage point to spy traders on a break sneaking a quick roll-up. My feet dangle above a committee of pigeons nibbling at a discarded foam dish. I warm my hands under a comforting bundle of folded paper bearing mouth-watering salty chips, sprinkled with delicious scraps of golden batter. Mormore reorganises the shopping bags, as I tuck in, and suggests we make a crumble this afternoon. I've brought my new kitten to Mormore's flat. After losing her sight to a degenerative condition typical of old age and gaining an infirmness that rendered her housebound, small joys are few. The tiny tabby is eager to sniff everything. It rolls across the rug and becomes engrossed with a section of fringing along the bottom of the sofa. Mormore must have had this sofa for 30 years. Everything in her flat is the same as it's always been, except the television, which was upgraded to a large flat screen, in the hope that Mormore might be able to catch the soaps in her remaining peripheral vision. It looks out of place next to the Formica coffee table, topped with ancient houseplants. The unruly vines of her trailing wax plant twist around its pot like a ball of rope. It's older than Mormore, grown from a cutting of a parent plant that once featured in her childhood home. Feeling around her ankles for the curious feline intruder, Mormore tells me that, growing up, her cat used to have kittens all the time. I wonder aloud how fun that must have been, but Mormore explains with surprisingly little sentiment, we weren't allowed to keep them. There weren't places that you could take unwanted kittens, and you couldn't get the cat done like you can do now. Whenever my cat had a litter, my father would drown them all. Mormor died on a Wednesday. It was a small death, expected. She had shrunk over time, but mostly in the last 2 weeks, and had complained about having cold hands and feet. At age 94, residing in a warm and brightly lit care home that had welcomed several houseplants as tenant too, this was expected. We spoke on one of her last coherent days. Hearing also absconded. Our last words to each other were shared in projected remarks and laboured whispers, respectively, and she asked me to tell her about my recently acquired engagement ring, which I proudly defined as the colour of both of our eyes. Like most of her life, my Mormor's death was quiet, but I'll best remember her in the market, bartering for strawberries and tugging at my hand to walk on.
Yay! Thank you so much, Marina. It's really fantastic to hear such beautiful non-fiction. Thank you so much. It was great. We are now moving somewhere completely different, and we're going to get some comedy in Hackney with Mike Clark, who'll be reading Stood Up. Mike studied on the Novel Studio when it was the Certificate in Novel Writing and the Writers' Workshop at City University. He went on to graduate with an MA in Creative Writing from Manchester Metropolitan University. Several of his short stories have been read in different parts of the world by the renowned Liars League. His non-fiction writing on pubs is regularly featured in the national press, and he also dabbles in performing stand-up comedy and is just finishing a novel. So please do help me in welcoming Mike to read. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Stood up. Jess walked forward to the stage. It couldn't be that hard, could it? 5 minutes? But she was dry-mouthed, shaking, heart pounding. She'd done similar before, been trained in standing in front of audiences, much more hostile than this. But then Jess had a role to play, as straight as she wanted. This was different. She didn't necessarily have to make them like her. No, it was something far worse. She had to make them laugh. The room was sweaty, packed, the lights concentrated on the small stage. Talk about hiding in plain sight. She was standing under 1,000 brilliant LEDs. She knew the figure, as she'd rigged the lights herself. She'd spent the last 2 months watching stand-ups of wildly varying abilities take to this stage. Some of it brilliant, and she tried to learn any tricks and techniques that worked for them. Others had been bloody awful, dying on stage without the slightest sign of a laugh. She couldn't be that bad, could she? And she suspected more than a few of these supposed comedians were there for reasons that, in reality, weren't so funny. Was this a good idea at all? She'd discussed it with Kat, and they'd last run in Victoria Park, and then stopped for rehydration in the People's Park Tavern. But you said all the staff there are encouraged to do a spot, Kat had said. Yeah, rite of passage sort of thing. And apparently, if you're half decent, then they'll collar you if one of the booked acts doesn't show, Jess had replied. So if you don't do it, you run the risk of actually losing the bar job. Kat was as pragmatic as ever. In that case, Jess asked, do you know any good jokes? Ladies and gentlemen, give a lot of love, a whole train of love, for our next act, the amazing Jess. Shit, Jess realised. Once your name is called, you can't go back. Her short, sparkling sleeveless dress exposed the tattoos on her toned biceps and thighs. looking the part of the sassy mid-20s streetwise girl, even if she didn't feel it. Jess stared down towards her cleavage, the tattooed inscription positioned at the top of her left breast, close to her heart. Getting that tattoo hadn't been a knee-jerk reaction. That way, he'd always be part of her. If you've loved that much, then you'd need more than a lifetime to forget it. What if there were hecklers? She hoped that some of that book of put-downs had stayed in her mind. Her hair was twisted into a long shock of ringlets. Some dyed a lighter brown at the edges. Damn these heels. They were just going to tip her over on her arse. Not the positive body language she knew was everything. She took the microphone from the stand, looping the cable in her hand, and strode to the front of the small stage. Legs straight and apart, she pushed her chest out assertively. She adopted her best badass expression. The room felt quiet. Jess might have imagined it, but she thought she heard a few stifled gasps. The lights were dazzling. Only the first couple of rows were visible, but she enjoyed the eyes on her, expectantly. She had the room for that second, at least. She liked it. Such a change from the last couple of months. Hello, Hackney. How are you doing? The audience seemed temporarily thrown by the flat vowels in her broad northern accent. I know what you're all thinking. Jess waved a hand in front of her chest in a gesture that could have either have drawn attention to her breasts or the colour of her skin. She's got up here to tell us all about her favourite real ale. A hesitant pause. Then a miracle. They laughed. And they laughed at her next gag and the next. Before Jess had got halfway through the material she'd memorised, she caught a glimpse out the corner of her eye of Adrian, that night's MC, giving her the 1 minute left wave. Thank you, Hackney. You've been fantastic. Jess placed the microphone back in the stand. Adrian bounded on stage as the applause rippled around the room. Fantastic set from Jess. If you enjoyed that, then you can come back and buy a drink, not for her, but off her, because Jess works here behind the bar most nights. But maybe not for much longer on that performance. The applause was genuine and generous. Jess knew that from her observing other acts from behind the bar. For a few seconds, she felt loved. She could understand why other people put themselves through the trauma of stand-up. While she'd been performing under the lights, listening to the murmur of anticipation after the laughter had died down from the previous punchline, then she felt relaxed and whole again. That gnawing, empty pain in the pit of her stomach had temporarily ceased. The adrenaline had felt like it coursed through her veins, radiated out of her skin, sparkled from her eyes, and, most crucially, flooded that aching void she carried inside her for the last 2 years. A joyous amnesiac. It had been tough, but it was like love, she figured. The only way for her to receive it was to make herself vulnerable and exposed, to risk rejection by seeking confirmation and validation. She carefully descended from the stage in those heels as Adrian launched into some linking patter about barmaids and his favourite drink. As she headed for the back of the room, Jess was conscious of heads turning and eyes attempting to make contact. As many women as men. Her material must have made an impact. That was fucking hilarious. Ellie the barmaid leaned over and whispered loudly. The next act, a suited guy with a random selection of puns and wordplay had started and was receiving polite laughs in return. What do you want? I'll put it on the house. Give me a pint of real ale, Jess said to Ellie's confusion. Nah, just a fucking quadruple vodka, and that's for starters.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This is my stand-up. Probably. I sometimes imagine I'd be good at it, but usually the laughter only comes at me rather than with me. But I love that story, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. We are going somewhere very different again. Mexico this time, and there's a bit of a cowboy feel, so prepare yourself. As A.S. Renard will be reading Cutthroat. Born in 1990, Andre Renard hails from Friendswood, Texas. Following stints in Buenos Aires, Paris, and Cambridge, he now resides in London, where he pursues a PhD in comparative literature. The author of several short stories and essays, his recent work can be found in the London and Medieval magazines. And his first full-length title, The Diamond Beneath the Dome, will be finished this summer. And I think I'm right in saying that he's an alumni of the short story course. I think that's right, yeah. So yes, please welcome Andre Renard as he reads Cutthroat.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just a word for everyone, this will be heavily accented Texan idiom, so I hope you can bear with me. Again, this is Cutthroats, and just an excerpt from part 1. You see this river here? He said, tracing his finger just in front of them. Know what it's called? Of course, Lefty. That's the mighty Bravo. Everybody knows that. Sure, kid, said Lefty. Here in Mexico, it's the mighty Rio Bravo. But once we cross it, once our horses' hooves set foot in Texas in the Union, it becomes the Rio Grande and nothing else. So there's trout in there then, asked Pancho. Cutthroats like the ones you were just talking about. No, kid, not in here there ain't. That's the funny thing about it. See, both the Chama and the Aguas Vivas Turlingueses are tributaries of the Rio Grande, which rises in the southern Colorado backcountry of the Rockies and the San Juans. But by the time that water reaches Texas, it's usually too damn warm for any type of trout fisher to survive in. But not in certain parts of Aguas Vivas, he spat. No, see, there's about a 10-mile stretch of that creek runs cold 365, even at the height of the summer heats in Augusto. And that's where you'll find them. Water's clearer than a crystal, too, which makes it easy to spook them cuts. And trust me, if they know you're onto them, they won't take the fly, won't even look at it. Them's a smart fish, kid. And to be honest, that's what makes stalking them so doggone exciting. But why's the water so chilly in Terlingua? Asked Pancho. Well, Lefty responded with an air of sagesse, I've heard it said that Aguas is spring-fed by an underground aquifer, and that's what keeps it running cool year-round. But there's a more sinister truth to it, Pancho. You see, Terlingua's an old Aztec holy site, and in each of the 3 forgotten tongues of the Aztec dialect, Terlingua actually means altar of the sun. Legend has it that during the days of Cortez's conquest of Tenochtitlan in the early 1520s, 7 fleeing Aztec priestesses lured 7 Catholic padres out into the wilderness around Terlingua. No one knows how exactly they got there, or why exactly they went. Likely promises of peyote, pearls, and peach, or a combination of it, he winked. But we do know that when the Catholic envoy arrived, it was ambushed and overpowered. Them padres were bound to the trunks of the decaying Chisis oak trees on the banks of the stream where they was flayed alive and drained, drop by drop, of their bone marrow. Then their blood was offered up as a sacrifice to the Aztecian sun deity, Hilipoyatzal, who bid the priestesses drink it on his behalf. Afterward, he continued, the padres' mutilated corpses was thrown into the creek, thereby desecrating its waters forever. The creek, they say, runs ice cold from the spot where the bodies first entered the water to the place where they was finally fished out. 10 miles, said Pancho in disbelief. 10 whole miles, said Lefty somberly. But it's the best trout fishing around, kid, and ain't nobody knows about it but you and me. The barbarians, whispered Pancho to himself. Yep, it's tragic, sighed Lefty. And then there's a crumbling churchyard sits on the banks of the Terlingua today, a relic from Spanish times called Los Siete Angeles. The place was built on the site of the attack itself and consecrated in honor of the 7 Spanish padres who were murdered at the altar of the sun. Tell you what, though, he said, his eyes widening in the darkness. I've seen some pretty ordinary trout swimming in the shadows of the bell tower, and they're just waiting for us, Pancho. waiting for us to pick 'em off and pluck 'em out of the water. The barbarians, repeated Pancho, a rage now burning within him. You know, he said a moment later, you never really understand the depths of human depravity until you hear something so vile as that. Lefty clicked his tongue and shifted slightly in the mud, grasping the handle of the saber sheathed against his hip, this too a relic of a bygone era. I've done some pretty depraved things myself, Pancho, he said. Many a father shed his lifeblood on my blade, and many a daughter lost her baubles to my trade. Never forget we're highwaymen, kid. Cutthroats no better than them bloodthirsty Aztec priestesses, and no more significant than them little fishes swimming about in their tilingua. Sure, I ain't never desecrated a dead man's body, and I sure as shoot ain't never drank nobody's blood. But I'm as bad a hombre as there ever was, Ponch, beyond any sort of redemption in this life and probably the next life too. And I know, he said, his voice laden with gravitas, for it's all said and done, I'll have to commit more atrocities, sin and kill, just to ride down another dawn. But I'll pay that price one day, he concluded, at the pearly gates, if not before. And so will you, if you keep saddling up beside me. An owl sounded on the Texan side of the river, and a few seconds later, the soft call of another followed in response. The two men, taken in by the calm of the water's edge, took it as a sign. The coast was clear, their passage imminent. As their steeds clacked and waded into the river, Lefty whistled a tune he picked up in Heroica about a French couple caught up in the Battle of Veracruz. He heard the hoot, hoot, hoot of the owl again, but the bird's mate made no such reply, and just as the convoy reached the midway point of the crossing, what some might have called the Rubicon, the horses whinnying in the moonlight as they grew accustomed to the water's temperature and flow, Lefty saw a show of sparks like a flint strike from the bluffs directly opposite his position. Before he knew what was happening, something whizzed by his ear in the darkness, the force and speed of which flipped his hat from his head, the object plonking into the water just behind him. The next instant, Pandora's chaos rained down upon them in the shape of bullets as muzzle flashes lit up the night sky and the booms of the Winchester repeating rifle echoed thunderously on the horizon. The air was heavy with the scent of fire and spent gunpowder, and Lefty, still in the lead, turned to see Bucktooth Elmo and Pancho's stallion hightailing it to the reeds in the shallows, toward the bank from whence they'd just ridden. But Pancho? No, Pancho wasn't in the saddle. Without delay, Lefty reached for his bandana and pulled it high up over his mouth, leaping headfirst from his mount into the now turbulent waters of the Rio Bravo and disappearing into the murky depths. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an amazing accent. I could listen to it. I'm not quite sure how I could ever say Mexico like that, but it's lovely. Yeah, it's strange to be moving from one kind of depravity to another now, because we're going to go to Linda Fritz, who's going to be reading Your Father's Face. Linda is currently writing her first novel, A Life Worth Living, and she is just also about to finish the novel studio. Last year she enrolled on the novel writing summer school, and that's apparently why she then decided to join the novel studio, which is fabulous. Consequently, she spent this academic year undertaking that, and she's never entered a competition before, so she was delighted to win this, and we're delighted she did as well. This is a fabulous story and a little unnerving, so prepare yourselves, and please welcome Linda.
I pick the ring up and study the way the light dances across the stones. Does it still fit? The rest of me has filled out since I last wore it, but my fingers look old woman scrawny. The third finger of my left hand, my ring finger, is still slender, but the knuckle has expanded with the repeated exercise of gripping onto the strands of my life that still have some remnants of meaning for me. And then I see his 5-year-old face, and he is staring me straight in the eye, denying all knowledge of the whereabouts of the ring. No, he hasn't seen my ring. No, he hasn't been in my room. No, he hasn't taken anything that doesn't belong to him. I knew he was lying. That lopsided grin masquerading as a winning smile spread across his face, ear to ear. His father's look. The one that tells me he is lying, that tells me he knows that I know he's lying, and there isn't a damn thing I can do to prove it. And I want to smack that smirk right off his face, just like I did that time with his dad. I want to see his mouth droop and quiver and release the words that tell me I am right. I want his face to crumple and know that he's sorry he ever crossed me. 3 of us are crammed up against the desk, our knees in touching distance, inside a giant fish tank that has been eked out of a corner of the waiting room. The glass walls are meant to shield us from prying ears, wailing children, and the inescapable stench of vomit and soiled nappies. I see snot smeared on the door. The overhead light buzzes and clicks. Hundreds of cicadas trapped inside. It flickers, dims, brightens, switching her hair from fluorescent white to honey blonde. Her long, tapering fingers tip-tap the keyboard. Her bleeper sounds. She checks it and carries on tip-tapping. She's so close. A mouth breather. I can smell the mouthwash she's used. Peppermint. So, talk me through what happened. Her eyes are fixed on the screen. Her tone of voice is light and friendly. He was playing with some of his Lego and he just stumbled. No, I want to hear it from him. Her tone is sharp and commanding. Her eyes dart from the screen and stare. I meet and hold her glare. She shifts her gaze. So, Thomas, what happened that meant you had to come to hospital with Mummy today? Eyes and mouth smiling, tone light and friendly. I keep my eyes on her and hold my breath. Will he tell her what we agreed as we drove to A&E? Will he remember it? We'd taken our time over it. The windscreen wipers zipped back and forth on double speed, sloshing and squeaking as they cut their way through the torrent of rainwater. The heater was pumping out its hot breath, wheezing with exertion. Over and over we practiced our lines, sing-song fashion, like we do the alphabet. Surely he'd remember it. It must be their training, I guess. This ability to bear silence, to remain patient and focused. Most people can't stand the vacuum silence creates. They have to rush to fill it, regardless of the absence of anything meaningful to say. They'd rather say something inane than say nothing and let the emptiness stretch into infinity. Like one of those pools you see in adverts for expensive holiday resorts, with gorgeous golden women peering across the invisible edge to the ultramarine ocean beyond. Tell the lady. She cuts me off with her stop hand, palm facing me, fingers upright and rigid. Her smiling eyes and mouth haven't blinked, twitched. I purse my lips and look at Thomas out of the corner of my eye. He's been recast as a statue. For fuck's sake, Thomas, tell her what we said in the car. It's not hard. It's one short sentence. We said it together over and over. Surely you can't have forgotten it. Come on, Thomas. Please, Thomas. The silent sea rolls in, cutting us off from the speaking land. The waves lap over our feet, and still we don't cry out, even though the water is cold. So cold, like that time in Cornwall. You and me cut off as the tide turned, and we played on for a while longer, so close to drowning. But your father came, just in the nick of time, risking his own life to save us. To save you, the hero, our saviour. Interfering bastard. Have you been struck dumb? Have I been swallowed up by deafness? And then he speaks. My arm hurts. Deaf and dumb, dragged away by the receding surf. Yes, she says, your arm is hurt. How did that happen, Thomas? Silence reclaims him, and she and I wait, partners in patience, hers professional, mine perturbed. A quote from Aristotle drifts across the years from my university days and settles itself, if-like, before me. Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet. His voice, soft and sweet, pushes back the tide that had threatened to engulf us. I hurt my arm when I fell, having stumbled over some of my Lego. Word perfect. Clever boy. Thank you, Thomas. And I swear to you, never again, I promise. I really mean it this time. Thank you for telling me, Thomas, she says, eyes and mouth sculpted in her work smile. She turns to look at me, her smile slipping off her face. Well, Mrs. Andrews, Ms. Andrews. Well, Miss Andrews. Did I say it right, Mummy? I turn to look at him, and there it is, that lopsided sneer masquerading as a winning smile spread across his face, ear to ear. His father's look, and I want to smack that smirk right off his face. I feel my mouth droop and quiver. I see her mouth lift at the corners, and small, even, pearly white teeth stare at me.
Yay!
Oh, that's so fabulous, Linda, and absolutely terrifying. Yeah, so I would really not like to meet that woman, although we all do understand the frustrations of motherhood. That is pretty scary. So thank you so much for that. It's been brilliant hearing from all the readers, all the competition winners who would have been reading in the spring, but obviously we had to delay, and it's brilliant that you've all been here on the Zoom. So thank you all so much. I'm also very excited that Shah Hussain is here. We had a little bit of a struggle to get her here, but she's now here, and the Zoom is working. Hooray! And Shah and I are going to have a conversation that is based around the recent new edition of the Virago Book of Witches, which, if you haven't read it, were we in a real room, we would now be able to sell you some. It is absolutely brilliant. And if you love fairy tales and you love the idea of witches, then you need to just press the button while we're chatting and buy your copy. It's just brilliant, and her preface is fabulous. So I'm really delighted that she is here. Shah was born and brought up in Pakistan. She studied myth and folklore from around the world for many years, and this is so clear in the book. She's the editor of the Virago Book of Witches, author of Women Who Wear the Breeches and Temptresses, the Virago Book of Evil Women, several children's books, a play for children. She writes screenplays. She's also a psychotherapist, and she's married to 2 children. I don't know how she has time for all of it. She's done some brilliant things. And I am so excited that she's here. So please, everybody say hello to Shah. Are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here. And I'm sad have I missed all the stories?
I'm afraid you have, yeah.
Will you send me, you're recording them, I'm presuming?
Yes, we are recording, and we'll definitely.
Linda's I heard, and that was fabulous. It's very chilling and beautifully read.
Yeah, pretty terrifying, isn't it? I just want to say how much of a fan I am naturally of fairy tales, and this collection was just fabulous. While I was nervously sitting waiting to come this evening, I was reading a few more. And there were so many things you said in the preface that just made me want to ask you so many questions. I know that you say that you couldn't find an anthology devoted to witches, to the celebration of what a witch represents, from a wild and terrifying creature of evil to a sedate and canny helper. And I wondered what it was that inspired you to create the collection originally, because I know it was originally your idea.
Yes, it was I loved stories about witches. I think that I probably got fascinated with them at a very young age. We had a Norwegian lady who lived near us. She was a diplomat or something. And she had a book of stories which had a story in it called Tatterhood. And it was about 2 princesses. One of them was, scruffy and rude and went around with this wooden spoon, whacking things and breaking things. And the other one was very beautiful, the perfect sort of princess that you expect. And I always rather identified with Tatterhood and her scruffy clothes, because I had have still, a very perfect sister. And she'd always have her hat on right and the flowers in her hands and greet people nicely, and I'd be sort of going up to them, can you tell me a story? So there was a distinct feeling that this girl has been badly treated in the story, and I kind of identify with her. Not that I was badly treated, but that sort of always getting it wrong and doing things and saying things that maybe I shouldn't have. This is when I was very small. So just this fascination began, and I kept thinking I wanted to write it. I'd, over the years, read literally hundreds of books, looking through and finding stories about witches, and some I remembered and some I didn't. So I saw Angela Carter's book of fairy tales, and I thought, yeah, maybe there's scope for one that's just about one thing, focused on witches. So I did what a good would-be writer would do. I found out the name of the person who was editing it. It was a woman called Ruth Petrie, who was Virago at the time. And I got in touch with her. I think I sent her a page. of what I wanted to do. That's right. And I'd gone out for a little while. When I came back, my husband said, Virago rang you. So I called back, and it was Ruthie, and she was really, really interested in the book. And she said they were going off to Frankfurt very soon, and she was going to take the synopsis, and came back and said that 59 people had shown interest in. Frankfurt is for second rights, for not the original. And so she said, let's get started, go quickly you can. So I had a ball. I mean, if they'd not paid me anything, I would still have done it. I would have done it 10 times over. I couldn't believe that I was actually being paid. I mean, there was a bit of a row between my agent at the time, Toby Eady, and Virago, and they're tough and he's tough. He's the guy who did wild swans with young child. So he's pretty tough. And I was very embarrassed about all that. But then my husband reminded me that I didn't have to be, because that was why we had agents. But yeah, I got on with it, and it was all done and dusted in 6 months. And I just loved it. It was, you know, I was being paid to do something that I absolutely loved, and I didn't have to do too many other things at the time. I had a little boy. Oh, and a little girl by that time. And I had a great time reading the stories to her. She was very small, but she loved it. And she would notice the stories and she would say, "Oh, Mummy, isn't that just like Cinderella, but it's in Indonesia?" You know, so that was fun too, you know, picking out the motifs and so on. And yeah, she's a successful journalist now.
Well, that's one of the wonderful things about the book. I mean, I've got so many questions, but one of them was about this idea that you kind of pick out all of these stories from so many different parts of the world. I mean, some of my favorites are, you know, there's China, India, amongst many other places. Wales, I love the Cauldron Born. And
I love it, yeah.
And I just, yeah, you talk about that. And I think this universality feels very relevant to the moment. And would you agree? I mean, I wondered what you would want to say about this idea of the fairy tale sort of uniting us across cultures.
I think it really does. And my other 3 books for Virago are the same. I've chosen specific topics and picked stories about, like the Virago book of Evil Women, Temptresses, they called it. It's about women who've had a bad press, usually from religion or society over the years, and you know, tried to look at their side of the story. Yes, I think definitely they do. In fact, it's a massive interior crusade with me to get people, more children, to know fairy tales. It breaks my heart when you mention a story that was well known in my as I was growing up, and children don't know it. You know, they know the big ones. They know Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella and, you know, 1 or 2 others, but even things like the Billy Goat Gruff or Rapunzel, not everyone knows them. So I've done some for children as well. I've done a series for children on myths and legends. I've taken the myths and legends of different cultures and written a book about each. I think there are 6 in the series, Ancient Civilizations. And
fabulous.
And children love it. I would take them to school to test on them, the stories, and they would say, "But Miss, that one's not as interesting as that one, and why didn't he do that? And how do you know that it's real?" You know, so it was great. The children are amazing guides to getting things right, because they're completely unforgiving, relentless.
Well, and also I think one of the things I really enjoyed about the book too is that you're not shying away from any of the kind of gory or slightly sexy aspects of the stories, in a way that I think a lot of the fairy tales that we read now have been kind of sanitized.
They were bowdlerized in a very terrible way by the Grimms, by the Brothers Grimm themselves, and yeah, so that's kind of found its way into all sorts of stories. Now, I did want to celebrate the aspects of womanhood that so many people think, you know, have sort of said, "Gosh, she's a shameless woman. If a woman slept with more than 1 man in 1 year, then she was a nymphomaniac." I remember in the 70s, if she invited a man out or showed that she was interested in him, there would be this thing about, "Oh God, look at her, she's setting her capital." All these very derogatory phrases, but why not? Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't we? And so, yeah, I thought there's nothing wrong with a woman who enjoys sex or takes the lead, or, you know, in fact, everything about women has been, you know, fairy tales have unfortunately, Charles Perrault did the same, because he was writing the stories for a princess, and so it had to be clean and courtly. But, you know, it fitted in very much with how people wanted women to be. They wanted them to be obedient, selfless, controlled, you know, do the right things, dignified, modest, chaste. It comes from the fact that we give birth, we carry the child, and there was no way that a man could know for sure that it was his child unless he made absolutely sure the woman didn't go anywhere else. So, I mean, the Jewish system has got it right. You're not a Jew unless your mother is one. Isn't that? I mean, I know it's not very strictly enforced or anything like that, but yeah, you know what the mother's, where the the child has come from the mother, and therefore he takes what he wants. But that was a big fear in the old days. They didn't want men to have to doubt anything, and they wanted to know. It was the man's name that had to continue, the man's fate that had to continue, not the woman's.
And do you think that's one of the reasons why it seemed really important to reissue the book now, and to write a new preface to it? This idea that, you know, all of these witches had been kind of cast as evil in order to kind of create a very sanitized version of women. And one of the great things you say in the preface is that witches represent the essence of the feminine mind, teaching us their ancient wisdom, their wiles and their guiles, and the truth that every woman must learn about her own magic.
Yeah, very much so. I think, again, you know, we have all these stories about wily women, and so I would call it resourceful. If you're someone who's shut away and have to make your own way or make things work for you, then yes, you do use wiles and guiles, and so what? You know what you want, you need to get it, and you do what you can to get it. You're not killing someone. So all those little things, and women do, of course, they still do continue with that. They won't say something outright. Not all women, but so it's quite common, particularly in more restrictive societies. So yes, I think every woman does have her magic, and it's very important that she should stay, sorry, lots of flowers around here. It's very important to know your truth and be able to express it. And I think too often women tend to just hold back. I mean, I still do it. You know, I might want to watch a television show with the kids, and my husband might want to watch something else. And they're not kids, they're all grown up now. I have a granddaughter living with me, but, you know, I'll say, okay, go on, you do that. I'll go and do a bit of writing, or you know, or I'll read while they're doing it. It's a small thing, it's a trivial thing, but it builds lots of things women tend to just take on, which they don't need to. So I think the witch in a woman is that bit that tells her, you know, I am a priority too.
Yeah, in fact, you said another thing you wrote was standing up to and destroying or disempowering the witch in fairy tales represents a vital stage of growing up and learning to respond resourcefully to the crisis at hand. However, this can only occur when we begin to acknowledge the witch in ourselves. And I just love that. And there was one image that came to my mind from reading the preface, which I really tried to find it before this evening, but I couldn't find it. And it's an 18th century painting of which depicts the horrors of a woman reading fiction. And she's lying in a field, like a beautiful field, and she's lying there with a book in one hand and the other hand resting sort of gently over her private area as she reads the book. The idea being that, you know, obviously to read novels is to lead you down a dangerous path.
There are whole theses written about it in and around Jane Austen's time, just before, about how it was terrible for women to read novels. I mean, my mother tells a very funny story. There's a huge Middle Eastern epic. It was oral, then it was written down by a couple of people many hundred years later. It's about 800 years old and massive. And one volume of it was about an alternate universe, which was magical. And apparently this book was never allowed to be anywhere near any woman or girl particularly. So she said that her brother-in-law, her sister was a lot older than her, and so her brother-in-law had come to visit, and he had this book with him, and he'd left it open on a certain page, and she looked. And she said she was so horrified, she quickly shut the book and ran out of the room and never told anyone about it at all. But I was working on it recently, trying to work it into a TV series. And she said, you know, I read a passage of that once. And I said, did you? And she said, yeah, I just wanted to see what it was that was so awful. And she said, the passage said, the woman lay on the bed, her legs slightly apart, on her back, on the bed, her legs slightly apart, merging with the silk and satin there. And from the beneath the breast down to the hip, her body was like a flat and smooth slate of sanded sandalwood. And she said it sounded so appalling because, you know, it was her body and she was lying there and, you know, her legs slightly apart, and it just seemed horrible. But they were stopped from reading it because they didn't want girls to feel excited about it. There was also a very famous love story, a suicide, you know, one of those death bride ones about the couple both killing themselves, and that also was banned. Children, women weren't allowed to read it, not unmarried women anyway. It was a poem. And the same, of course, was happening here too earlier on. It was meant, later on it became thought of as a waste of time for women to read novels and waste their time on fairy tales. But fairy tales have always been told by mothers to children, and there are some pretty risque ones out there.
Yeah, I mean, I love what, I think you did the rewriting of Indravati and the Seven Sisters.
Yeah.
And I loved that one with these kind of terrifying witches with their feet turned backwards, but who are perfect otherwise, who are desperate to get their mitts onto this handsome prince.
Yeah, lustful. I thought, sometimes when stories were told when I was younger, there would come a time in the story where something risque was happening. And very often, to my frustration, I was usually the only kid who was interested enough to sit and listen, was sent off to go and tell someone to make the tea or to fetch the oranges or, you know, something or the other. And by the time I came back, it was gone. So there were these little mysteries in my head by these two women who've got married because one thinks the other's a man. So what happens when they get married? You know, are they gay? Are they, do they discover something or the other about, you know, do they find, or is it just one of those chaste marriages where people are in love but don't do anything? One of those weird ones, rather. So those were the missing bits I wanted to put back into the story in this one. I mean, after all, if there were seven sisters looking down and trying to get rid of the bride and you know, sort of wanting the prince to themselves, then there must have been more than just wanting to stare at him, I think. They're pretty rapacious.
Well, I love your retelling. I think it's brilliant. Lots of other questions. I had this very long question because I've recently been reading a book which is called What Doesn't Kill You: 15 Stories of Survival, and it's actually a book about mental illness and kind of and surviving with it. And there's one particular story which is called No Cure for Life, written by Julian Beghini. And actually, I thought of asking you about this because, well, one, because he kind of tries to say that fairy tales, modern fairy tales, have kind of been turned into this search for happiness. That we are all reading these kind of memoirs written about people who've suffered trauma, often in childhood, and then kind of go on, succeed in life despite their difficulties, and that we are rather addicted to these. And all of that, you know, I was quite on board with that. And I thought, yes, it's very interesting that he's saying that things like, you know, we shouldn't just be striving for happiness, but perhaps something, you know, that the idea of happiness has been something that would continue on and last forever is slightly ludicrous. But then he goes on to say fairy tales are for children, and grown-ups who continue to believe in them are not equipped to deal with the real harshness of life. Any benefit they get from temporary reassurance is more than cancelled out by the bewilderment and despair of inevitably discovering that these reassurances are false. And I was like, wow, he hasn't read a lot of fairy tales.
It's curiously old-fashioned thinking, isn't it? Because first of all, the Grimms were a couple of brothers, were a couple of academics, hardcore, especially Jakob. And they went around the country listening to stories, collecting stories in the proper story collection manner. It was then they bowdlerized some of it at a later stage, but it was an Englishman, I forget his name now, who selected 32 stories and put them together, and they were fireside tales, they were for children. And then the Kindermärchen was published. That was put back into German and published as a German book, and that was the one that we inherit mainly. But if you think about stories like Red Riding Hood even, or Bluebeard, and so on, nothing to do with children, are they really? I mean, I didn't read them to my children.
No, and nor are they about some kind of imagining that you end happily. I mean, many of the stories in the collection, in your collection, aren't really about a happy ending. I mean, just thinking about that one, that the Cauldron Born, where the kind of helper of this witch is told that he mustn't touch the mixture in the cauldron, but then a bit splashes on him, and then he undergoes this kind of rebirth where he sees the whole world and is terrified and horrified and amazed all at once, and becomes something completely other. There's nothing really happy or naught about that. It's just what happens to him.
It is what happens, and I think that's why stories were originally told. I think way back when, our ancestors told stories around the fireside because there was not much else to do and too dangerous at that time of night. I'm talking about, you know, prehistoric man even, and there were pictures of frescoes and things of huge mammoths and so on. And I think basically, certainly the Jungian way of thinking as well, and I think certainly agree, I am a Jungian, that those stories were told, those adventures with all the dangers and threats and the helpers along the way, were to prepare people for life. You know, you are going to meet monsters, you are going to meet witches, you are going to meet people, but you know, everybody's not exactly as they seem. They may seem like a ferocious lion. You know, Androcles, the lion didn't attack him because he had once taken a splinter from his paw. There are these dreadful witches. There's a very picturesque witch in some parts of the Middle East who's an ogress, you know, a giant. And she usually sits by a stream with massive boobs. And the hero who was going to collect, to find her and get her to help him, was told that he's going to find her by the waterside, and he must call her aunt, because if he calls her aunt, then she can't harm him, because he's shown her respect. And then she would flee. When she ran and the guy chasing her, she would just furl her boobs over her shoulders. So, you know, there's a lot of fun in them as well. And I think a lot of these people are, I mean, a lot of the lessons are that, you know, life is difficult. You have to negotiate your way through things. People who you trust will often not be trustworthy. People who you don't trust will often or don't, you know, fear, will turn out to be different, or sometimes you have to do something for them in order to get something back. These are all life lessons. And I think that we can all read the stories and interpret those as adults. I think adults rereading stories of their youth, or even new ones, can really enrich themselves by, you know, reading them carefully and getting a lot of meaning out of them, which they wouldn't have got as kids.
Yeah, I completely agree. And some of the language is beautiful. I mean, just at the beginning of that one, the Cauldron one we talked about, you know, as I know the power of words, the building of one syllable upon another, the placing of the words in certain order so that they make a single incontestable truth. I mean, you know, these are really wonderful tales. I'm conscious of the time. And when we last spoke, we talked a little bit about your other books for Virago. And everyone can see just how fabulous your knowledge of all of these tales is. And I'm hoping they're going to rush off and buy some more. But during the rehearsal, we talked a little bit. You were saying you were working on a novel at the moment about a witch. And I wondered, if you don't mind talking about work in progress, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have written a few chapters, and then there were other things in between that I had to finish. So I'm hoping to get back to it in August. It's set in the late 17th century, just before the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment. And it's, I'll tell you the beginning. I won't tell you too much else because I haven't quite decided how it'll go. It's about a woman whose father he's a farmer. He's sort of a gentleman farmer. He's sort of given up because he's fed up with his wife's nagging and you know, his useless son and all the rest of it. So she learns from him. She learns quite a lot to do with reading and so on, but she basically manages the farm. And this man arrives out of the blue who just says, give me a piece of, you know, corner of your field to live in, and I'll do whatever work you need. Just when I go into my shack and close the door, I don't want you to come in. He turns out to be a traveling shaman, and she marries him, but then he decides he doesn't want to, he has to move on, because he's what's called a death walker. It's someone who goes into another dimension and helps people who are dying to leave their bodies and be liberated. So she's left on her own, you know, running this little hedge school for children, and the squire next door, with the, you know, whose land attaches to hers, wants to buy the land off her, and she doesn't. So he does the classic thing of, you know, saying she's a witch. Her mother does do a bit of spell crafting and so on, but it's not. It's nothing serious. It's just medical stuff and, you know, ointments and embrocation. So she goes to prison and is in terrible conditions and really can't. They used to be kept in a room roughly 4 by 6 feet, and there would be about 30 people there, so they couldn't breathe and they couldn't fall, and they did whatever they had to do in there. They couldn't even fall because there was no space to slip down. And so when her mother comes to her and says, look, you know, I've heard about these things, these meetings that happen in the middle of the night on certain nights of the month, I will go there and see if I can make a pact with the devil to free you, but you have to give him your soul. And she's quite upstanding, really, that she's gone to such a state that she says, fine, I'll do that. But then the age of reason happens, and there's a reprieve for all the people who've been accused of witchcraft. So she's one of them, and she comes out. And she says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give my soul to the devil because he's not done anything for me anyway. So the whole story then is about it's called The Soul of Isabel Chancel. It's the devil chasing her to get the soul, and the fights she has to fight to go through it. So the theme that runs through it is about women, the treatment of women throughout the ages, just as the witch persecutions were. You know, I don't know if most people know that Jung thought, in Jungian theory, women, everyone has two sides to them, the dark and the light. So at a particular point in history, when the Virgin Mother was being raised much more than before, the witch persecutions happened. And one of Jung's followers, you know, women who worked with him, Marie-Louise Wons-France, has written some wonderful stuff about fairy tales. And one of the things she said was that women were split off at that point from their harsher side or their darker side. And they had to be pure and good and wonderful, just the things we were talking about before. So what happens to the shadow? The shadow then gets split off and made into another creature, and that creature is the witch, and that was the one that was being persecuted around the same time as Mary was being elevated more than ever before. So I think that's something that kind of lost my thread now. But yeah, that's something I'm very interested in, and how that the remnants of that have continued right down into the present day, and we have them in you know, the Me Too stuff, all sorts of stuff coming up. And it's not just sexual things, it's lots of other things as well, in lots of small ways. I mean, the glass ceiling for women, you know, lower pay, using their children to make them do things, lots, and even just being left to look after the children or being forced to have them. All of these things, and they've happened throughout the ages. So I really wanted to address that. And I suppose the throbbing question at the end of it is, what do we do to get out of it? How do we stop it?
Oh.
It's not going to happen in our lifetimes, I don't think, but it might start.
I think, you know, you are so interesting to talk to, Shah. I mean, really excited about the novel, and I think your preface to the collection just has all of these ideas in it. It feels like this is a good place to start to whet everyone's appetite before they buy the book when it comes out. And yeah, I just really want to thank you for coming here and talking to us this evening. And I want to encourage everybody to buy your work, to watch your films. I know that In Custody was an adaptation of Anita Desai's Booker-nominated book, wasn't it? And that received won the President of India Gold Medal and received an Oscar nomination. And you also did the 6-part series Beecham House.
Yeah, that was in the summer. Yeah.
It's you're fabulously prolific and really interesting to talk to, and we're so lucky to have had you here. Just thank you so much.
It's lovely to ask me. Lovely of you to ask me. It's lovely to come back to City. I was once a student there.
Hooray, we're very pleased you were.
Already, but hi, Miss.
Hello.
There hasn't been lots of stuff in the chat, but if anyone did want to ask Shah anything, then I'm sure she'd be keen to answer questions. Or we're just all wowed by everything. It's going to take us a while to take it in.
Can I ask, I don't know whether you can hear me?
Yes, I
We can hear
can.
you, Neil.
I was just going to ask, are there any, have you come across any communities, any societies where there aren't witches?
No, there are communities who say they don't believe in them, and they might not. They might not believe that they're around. But I don't think there's any community that I know of that doesn't have some form of a witch in its folklore and its history.
There you go, Neil.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. In fact, I remember when Witches had just come out, there was a man who called me and said, could I tell him something about the green-faced witch? So I was telling him about the Kaylee, who's in the book here. She's a winter witch, a nature witch. And I then went to see a musical many years later, some years later, with my daughter. And it turned out to be the same guy, and he'd taken all the stories that I told. Of course, he built a wonderful story of his own, but I was very peeved that he didn't send me a copy of his book, because he spent quite a few hours talking to me about the Kaylee. I mean, his story was completely original. There was nothing to do with me. I'm not claiming that. But I just thought it would have been nice to have a signed copy. But that
Who knows
kind of
what
nature
stories will be written tonight.
That would be wonderful. I just want to say that listening to the start of some of those stories the other day was so wonderful that I feel like writing some myself now. I haven't for a long time. I have a list of ideas that I haven't gone back to, but I was listening to all of you, and I was absolutely enthralled, and I'm really looking forward to listening to them. Linda, I think your story reminded me a little bit of the spirit of Zoe Heller's Booker winner. I forget the name of it, the one that was played by Judi Dench.
Notes on a Scandal, was it?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, that sort of, about her. Brilliant, I loved it.
Oh, thank you. I just want to thank everybody for coming, everyone for reading, and Shah for being here and being so fantastic. We will have another City Writes next term. It's probably going to be online again. And we will have alumna Deepa Anapara, whose wonderful novel about child disappearances on the outskirts of a large Indian city, Gin Patrol on the Purple Line, was longlisted for the Booker Prize this year. And if you haven't read it, it really is a great book.
I bought it, it's on my to-read list.
Oh, you've got something to look forward to. Yeah, so the deadlines for the competition and event dates will be announced sometime in September. But this has been a really fun night, and even though we haven't been able to have a drink and chat to each other in the same way as normal, it's just I've been delighted that we've run it anyway. And thank you all for being here, and yeah, just thank you to everyone. Well done.
Thank you for putting it all together, Emily and Rebecca.
Yeah, it's been lovely to see
Thank you.
Well done, everyone. Well done. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Have a
Bye.
good rest of the evening.
Bye. It's nice to
Bye-bye.
see you all.
Mm.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Well done. Bye.